All right, everybody. So today we're going to be finishing the war. Such a nice day outside. I had to go do this outside. So don't get distracted by the sprawling Costanzo estate in the background. I should have gotten sunglasses. Too bright out here. I don't like the summer. The only teacher must not like the summer. It's too hot, too bright. I don't know what it says about me, but I like it cold and dark in the winter. All right. So let's take a look. After the Battle of Vicksburg, which we looked at last time, where Grant becomes really well known, we looked at this last time where he took out Vicksburg, splitting the Confederacy in half. Grant is now given overall command of the Union forces. And it is obvious that he is going to wage total war on the Confederacy. So Grant basically says he is willing to outbleed Robert E. Lee. He knows he has way more soldiers, he has way more resources. He is willing to fight this thing to the bitter end and take Lee on head to head. Whereas most Union generals had tried to avoid taking on Lee head to head because it hadn't gone well. But Grant has a different strategy. He says we shouldn't just fight the war against Lee and his army. We should be fighting the war against the entire South. So he sends William Tecumseh Sherman. Tecumseh was a very famous American Indian chief who he's actually named after. He actually sends William Tecumseh Sherman to march through Georgia. He's going to march all the way across Georgia, through Savannah, all the way to Savannah, burning his way across the entire South. And he literally does this. He burns his way across Georgia. Take a look at this personal voice up here. Eliza Andrews says, "The fields were trampled down and the road was lined with the carcasses of horses, hogs, and cattle that the invaders, meaning the Union, unable either to consume or to carry away with them, had wantonly shot down, to starve out the people and prevent them from making their crops. The dwellings that were standing all showed signs of pillage," meaning they stole stuff, while here and there lone chimney stacks, called Sherman's sentinels, or I've heard them called Sherman's toothpicks, that told of homes laid in ashes. They marched in a single file. They were shoulder to shoulder line, and they literally destroyed every single thing they came across. They came across a railroad tie. They would pull it up, heat it up, and pull them up so the railroads couldn't run. They came to a house, they'd take everything out of the house they wanted and then burn it. They came to a farmer's field full of cows. They would take the ones that they wanted to eat, and the extras they would shoot so they couldn't feed Confederate soldiers. That's total war, where you actually wage war on an entire population. Now, it's one of the reasons why Lee doesn't win the war. Lee was not willing to do that. He was not willing to kick women and children out of their homes and burn them down in Pennsylvania. So Grant is really ahead of the ballgame. This is really World War I style fighting. These victories, though, and the fact that the South is starting to collapse helps Lincoln win the election of 1864 for his second term. And by the spring of 1865, Robert E. Lee realized he could not win this war. It was not going to happen. And he said he wasn't going to have a single man die in a war that he thought was pointless. So the moment he thought he was going to lose, he actually calls to meet Grant. And they meet in a guy's living room in a little town called Appomattox Courthouse in, I think it's in like southwestern Virginia. They meet for a surrender. Grant actually gives very, very generous terms, meaning they didn't imprison any Confederates. They didn't imprison the leadership. They told the soldiers if they left their rifles and left, they wouldn't be taken to a prisoner of war camp. They just had to go home. He allowed Lee and his commanding staff to keep their swords and firearms. He didn't strip them of those. There were a lot of people in the North who wanted Robert E. Lee hanged for his part in the war. They wanted to hang all of the Confederate leadership. And Lincoln, as well as Grant, were not going to do this. Remember, Lincoln, in his second inaugural address, given, I think in March of 1865, March of 1865 says, with malice towards none, meaning with hatred towards none, and charity towards all. So Lincoln was not going to punish the South, as he saw it, like the radical Republicans wanted to. the Civil War is now, for all intents and purposes, it is over. There was a little bit of fighting that would still happen, very small skirmishes for a couple of months, but it was basically over. Bloodiest war in American history. And the war really does leave a very long legacy. Even today in the United States, there are Civil War monuments everywhere. If you go to Virginia, the Shenandoah Valley, they're everywhere. And here's why it drastically changed the nation. Before the war, people would have said, these United States, meaning these individual states that are now united. After the war, people said, the United States, meaning a single government. It kind of plays into this. The federal government became far more powerful during the Civil War than it had ever been beforehand. They were taxing people's income. They were making new laws that regulated people's behavior. They went to paper money for the first time in large numbers. There was a draft that could force you to go to war. This issue, the states' rights issue, does not go away. What it does do is it changes. No longer are we arguing over nullification and things like that. Now it was over how much authority does the federal government have. What can they tell the states to do? So the issue doesn't go away, but it does change. Another thing is the Southern economy is completely destroyed. Right? If you get rid of slavery, we've talked about this a lot. As you get rid of slavery, you're getting rid of the only way the South can make money. Large-scale agriculture. So during the war, the North built tons of factories, built tons of mechanized industries. They're all using steam engines. The North is getting richer, while the South gets very poor. The South got a lot poorer. So we start to see this imbalance between the North and the South. That really does continue well into the 20th century, and even in some parts of the South still today, although now the South has the fastest growing economy. My numbers didn't come up. I animated these. Oh, that's annoying. Okay, so let's take a look. The old numbers that we used to go by as a historian, they were recorded in 1889 by 2 Civil War veterans. How many people died? The number for years was 618,222. 360,000 from the Union, 258 from the Confederacy. Recently, a new report came out talking about how those numbers were probably inaccurate. And a historian did a very cool study where he looked at all of the census records, because they've all been computerized, and he came up with this number, 750,000 dead. That is a lot of people, especially when you consider the population of the United States was far, far smaller at the time of the Civil War. It was a huge percentage of the population. Also, nobody really talks about this, but 500,000 men were injured, and injured severely. And I'll show you a couple pictures here. So, of course, you know about all the dead, the battlefield strewn with bodies, not buried for months. Many times there were skeletons when they actually were buried. There you have Antietam, right, this bloody legacy of the war. Let me move my... Oh, where did I go? I'm gone. I don't know how to get me back. Oh, there I am. Don't want to lose my handsome mug. We don't talk about, though, the men who were injured. I mean, this poor guy lost both of his forearms. Now, this isn't 2020, where we have very good prosthetics. You were basically at the mercy of whatever they could fashion. There were a lot of men who were severely injured. There's no pain medication for today. So we actually start to see huge amounts of opioid addiction. So you could buy straight heroin at the time, and people were doing that for pain. You could also buy cocaine through the mail, which people were doing for pain. Alcoholism runs rampant. These poor guys didn't have the advances of modern medicine. If you're very interested, I'll post this slide. Civil War surgery was brutal. There was no way to put you out for a surgery. This guy was awake when they amputated both of his arms. This guy was awake when they amputated his leg. So this surgery video is pretty cool. Go and watch it. Also, the United States spent a ton of money. $3.3 billion, which doesn't seem like much today, considering our government spends money like it's water. But that $3.3 billion, if you added up all the money that the country has spent in the previous 80 years, the Civil War cost more than all of it put together. So this is a huge, huge, momentous occasion that really does change the country. It also changes a lot of lives. Lincoln wants to end slavery once and for all. He wants to end slavery, but he needs a constitutional amendment. We'll look at this in, in the film Lincoln, but also, I'm not sure we'll watch the whole thing. I'll probably show you part of it. But also the Southern economy, like I said, is completely destroyed. The South is going to have to figure out a new economy, which we'll look at in the next chapter. Southern leaders actually go back to normal lives, for the most part. Robert E. Lee goes and becomes president of Washington College, which today is Washington and Lee University. Jefferson Davis goes back. Now, he's not allowed to hold a public position. That was the one thing. They were not allowed to hold a public position. And he went back, and he actually worked as for the state of Mississippi in an unofficial manner for a while. So these guys try to assimilate back into normal life. But people start to look for new ways to make money, and one of them is, in the North especially, new factories. In the South, if you're a poor Confederate War veteran, the government passes a bill that we'll look at in the next chapter called the Homestead Act, where you can be given land out west. Many, many men take advantage of this. And lastly, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. We all know this. Lincoln is shot by John Wilkes Booth, which should be capitalized. Booth was a very famous actor. Most people in Washington, D.C. knew who he was. He was a Confederate sympathizer, and Lincoln loved the theater, so he was going to see this play called Our American Cousin. It was a British play, and he goes, and he invited Ulysses S. Grant and his wife. However, his wife didn't want to go, and he kind of begs out of it. So, Lincoln invites a young guy who had a really cool last name. His last name was Rathbone. So, Corporal Rathbone was a Civil War veteran. They go up, and Lincoln told his guard he could have the night off. It's a bad night to do that, Abe. Tells him he can have the night off. So there's no one guarding the door. Booth sneaks up into the booth and shoots Lincoln in the back of the head. As you all know, he jumps off of the banister and yells, "Sic semper tyrannis," which is the motto of the state of Virginia. It's Latin. It means sic means thus, semper means always, and tyrannis in Latin means tyrant. So, thus always to tyrants. Basically, like, this is always what will happen. Lincoln does not die immediately. He actually is taken across the street to a boarding house where he does die the next day. His Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, makes this very profound statement. He says, now he belongs to the ages. Most people realized that Lincoln was now a real hero to the average person. And in fact, a secret picture was taken of Lincoln lying in state, dead. And the picture wasn't found for many years. A guy took it and then hid it in a library book at the Library of Congress. So here's Lincoln lying in state. He was actually embalmed, and his body was pretty well preserved for almost 70 years. He also, I've got a pretty cool video I'm going to show you guys about that. Lincoln also had a funeral train take him back to Illinois to be buried. And the train was seen by almost 1/3 of the population of the United States. It was well marked out. He had funeral services in 7 or 8 different cities where you could go and see the body. Open casket funerals. So Lincoln is ingrained into that list of American presidents like Washington, like Jefferson before him. Alright, so that is the end of our PowerPoint. AP guys, you will have a test on Friday on chapters 19 through 21. Start studying. Start studying. I'll have a review video for you tomorrow. College prep guys, we will do the same thing. Test on Friday, and we will have a review video as well tomorrow. Have a good day. I will talk to you later.